Hi, welcome to the second half of Session 10, History 3380, World Civilizations. This session is about national liberation and the rise of nation-states out of rebellions against the colonial system established by Europeans, especially during the 19th century. And last time, we looked at India and we looked at Vietnam, two contrasting cases in the sense that India achieved independence with relatively non-violent methods. On the other hand, in Vietnam, we find a situation where the Vietnamese had to engage in years of armed struggle before they finally liberated their country and eventually had a united Vietnam. Today we're going to look at Africa and the Middle East. And in looking at Africa, we're looking at a situation where we're going to find both nonviolent or relatively nonviolent and also violent courses to independence. And the difference between these two is the result of a series of factors, but one factor that's consistent is that those colonies that experienced significant violence in their effort to achieve independence were almost inevitably places where large numbers of Europeans had come to settle. That meant that aside from whatever decisions might be made in London or Paris in regards to liberating these colonies, there was another important voice which consisted of tens of thousands, often hundreds of thousands of Europeans who had established themselves in these colonies during the 19th century and were largely unwilling to surrender control to the indigenous populations. In places where those European populations were relatively small, on the other hand, usually nonviolent means would be sufficient because it was a matter of pressuring the government, in other words, the colonial government back in Europe, and it was an easier decision for them to make when they were not dealing with hundreds of thousands of their own citizens who were insisting on the preservation of the colonial order. Now, if we go to the first slide, we're going to look at some of the factors that led to the rise of liberation. Part of this has to do with African resistance. Even though the movements for independence mostly erupted by the late 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, the fact is that Africans had long been resisting the colonial order. The first example here of John Chilembwe, who was a resident of Malawi. He was educated in Christian schools, including in the United States, and much like other independence leaders, such as Nehru, for example, in India, Chilembwe himself picked up many of his ideas about resistance to colonial rule as a result of his Western education. And he took the opportunity in 1917, when the British, who controlled this region, were fully engaged in World War I, to try to lead an armed resistance to British control. His efforts failed. There was not a sufficient base of popular support that he could mobilize at this time, and as a result, the British were able to crush his rebellion. But it is an indication of the fact that Africans were not simply accepting of colonial rule as much as the British and the French and the Germans might try to portray the situation in that form. Much of the resistance took forms other than armed insurrection. One example occurred in Nigeria in the 1920s. In 1929, a woman in the Igbo tribe, a group of Nigerians located largely in the southern portions of Nigeria itself, a woman in the Igbo tribe refused to let a colonial inspector count her goats, which sounds like a rather uninteresting non-event. But it became very important. First of all, the reason for her resistance to the simple fact that the colonial official wanted to count her goats was that she was certain, and she was right, that this was going to be used as a way of imposing new taxes on the local population, that they would now be taxed on their property, such as the goats. So she refused to allow him to do that. Facing pressure from the colonial government, she engaged in what had been a common practice among women in Nigeria, and that is gathering other women together in order to resist pressures from male-dominant groups. And that meant not just, of course, the colonial officials, that now ruled the region, but also in previous generations, resisting the males who dominated the tribal governing structures. The specific method used by Igbo women was called sitting on a man. And what this meant was that the women would come together as a large group and publicly embarrass the male or males who were causing problems for one of their sisters. In this case, the colonial official found his house surrounded by nearly 1,000 Igbo women, none of whom were wearing any clothes, just to get his attention, and began singing satirical songs and denouncing him and making jokes about him. This was their way of isolating a male and demeaning him in order to pressure him to end whatever actions he was taking against one of their number. In this case, however, colonial officials reacted by bringing in the police, who opened fire, killing a number of the demonstrators and wounding many others. So here was an indication that people, yes, could organize and could form resistance movements, but it was also clear as of the 1920s that colonial officials were still quite willing to use violence to put down such demonstrations. Now, the ability of the colonial states to go on enforcing their rule in Africa and in other parts of the world was severely impacted by the outbreak of World War II. Many of the colonial bureaucrats that governed the various states in Africa had to be pulled out back to Europe because they had critical skills needed in the war effort. That meant, on the one hand, a certain weakening of administrative structures, but it also meant that more Africans found themselves in positions of authority in the colonial bureaucracy. They had to be promoted now because they had to take over in order to keep the system running. That meant more Africans now had administrative experience, had a better idea of what was going on in the system itself. They would be better equipped to lead a resistance in the future. Something else that happened was a rapid expansion in the economies of the African colonies because of the enormous demand for many of their products, such as rubber, copper, and other goods that were obviously needed for the industrial plants of Europe in order to manufacture the sinews of war. What this meant was rapidly growing economies for Africa. For example, between the 1930s and the 1950s, the exports of the Belgian Congo increased by 300% over about a 20-year period, from the late 30s to the late 50s. Much of this driven by World War II and then the Korean War after that. What this also meant was that it created new opportunities for Africans themselves. First of all, many Europeans have gone back to their homelands because of the war. Secondly, the economies are rapidly expanding, creating opportunities where Africans can now insert themselves and better exploit their own economies. Another factor that influences what happens is the rapid urbanization of Africa. A common phenomenon around the world is affecting Africa as well, and that is an increased migration of people from rural areas into the cities. An increasing awareness that cities offer educational institutions, sanitary facilities, medical facilities, many things that are still unavailable in the countryside, and of course jobs. All of these serve as magnets to attract a growing number of people from the rural areas into the urban areas. The significance for us is that with people concentrated in urban areas, it's that much easier for them to organize politically than when they're stretched out over vast rural areas. In addition, the growth of the economy, combined with growing African participation in local economies, meant an expanding middle class. These people typically have at least some basic education, they're literate, and given the fact that they hold middle-class jobs, it usually means that they have some degree of spare time that they can now devote to issues such as politics. Another factor is that an increasing number of industrial jobs were becoming available. whether it was in the form of jobs in the railroads, the mines, basic factories that were being built. We have an expanding working class. And again, working class people have typically quickly organized themselves to deal with the challenges of the workplace, issues of wages, hours, etc. And this was going to happen in Africa too, even though in most cases it was outlawed. Unions were outlawed for Africans. Nevertheless, they organized despite that. All of these groups are going to provide a fertile area in which those promoting national liberation can work. These are a ready group of people who can be accessed, who can be mobilized. Now, on top of all of that comes discontent in the countryside. If people were flowing into the cities, it was indeed in part because of the attractions that urban areas held in terms of growing economies, jobs, education. But it was also true people were leaving the countryside because of the loss of land. As the demands for agricultural products grew in Europe, more and more land was being taken from Africans to be inserted into growing plantation systems in Africa for producing export products. So more and more peasants were increasingly discontented with the system as they faced this loss of land. That will contribute yet another group to those who can potentially be mobilized for national liberation. Now, the first example we're going to look at is the British colony of the Gold Coast, which is located on the southern shores of the great hump of Africa. This was a classic instance of a European colony where relatively few Europeans had settled. The climate was a tropical one, hot, humid, year-round. It was not a climate that was conducive to European settlement. There were various diseases that Europeans easily contracted because they had no prior resistance experience with them. And so a relative handful of British merchants and bureaucrats settled in the Gold Coast. Its economy was based principally on the export of coffee. Coffee that was being raised by African farmers, people who ran small commercial operations producing the coffee for export. Now, independence organizations had cropped up in the Gold Coast as early as the beginning of the Second World War. But it's really the arrival of Kwame Nkrumah back in the Gold Coast, a young man who had gotten his education in both England and the United States. It's his return to the Gold Coast in the late 1940s that really spurs the push for independence. Through his convention People's Party, Nkrumah starts doing something that other organizations had not dared to do, and that was calling for immediate independence. Earlier organizations had done the kind of thing that I mentioned when we first started talking about national liberation. That is, they were critical of the colonial system, they sought reforms within it, but now here was a leader who was demanding immediate independence. Again, part of this is his own education, but part of it too has to do with the realities of the Gold Coast, that much like the rest of Africa, you now have a thriving middle class, you have a growing urban working class, and those provide substantial constituencies for someone who wants to promote independence. Furthermore, there was a critical issue that was driving the middle class, which are the African farmers, and that is that, well, their economy had been growing substantially since the Second World War began. Nevertheless, they had to deal with British merchants who monopolized all international trade, which meant that the British merchants could dictate the price of coffee that the Africans had to sell, and the British could also control the price of essential imports, farm tools, fertilizer. And farmers were convinced that the British were using their monopoly to exploit these farmers, that they were paying the lowest price possible for the coffee, charging maximum prices for the imported goods. So this gave Nkrumah a substantial constituency sympathetic to his ideas about immediate independence. Nkrumah largely relies on nonviolent methods. Boycotting of British merchants and British goods, protest marches to demonstrate against the colonial regime. Despite that, he was thrown into prison for sedition, for trying to undermine the colonial order. But the British realized that throwing Kwame Nkrumah in jail was not going to stop the demonstrations or the boycotts by the Convention People's Party. And finally, in 1951, an election was held, you really might call it a plebiscite, to determine the future of the colony. And by an overwhelming vote, the people of the Gold Coast sided with the Convention People's Party in calling for independence. Nkrumah was released from jail, and over the next 6 years, the British turned over increasing responsibilities to his government till finally in 1957, Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party took total control, and the Gold Coast emerged as the independent nation of Ghana. Now, here again is a relatively nonviolent course to independence, and again, the clear indicator of this is the fact that really British bureaucrats in London could make this decision without having to account for a large number of European settlers in the colony. So they were less resistant than they might have otherwise been to the idea of independence for the Gold Coast. In fact, this was the first European colony to achieve independence in Africa. But it was by no means the last. Dozens of new African states would appear over the next 3 decades. A contrasting example, even though it was very close chronologically to the events in Ghana, was the British colony of Kenya, located on the east coast of Africa. Kenya had attracted hundreds of thousands of British settlers. It had a relatively temperate climate. Much of the country consists of highlands, which means that you have relatively cool mountain air, temperate climatological conditions that attracted these people to especially setting up farms and ranches to develop agricultural and grazing exports. That alone suggested that the struggle for independence was not going to be an easy one. The man who came to lead the independence struggle was a man named Jomo Kenyatta. Kenyatta had received his education in Christian schools. He was very familiar with Western education. And he emerged, along with a number of other figures in Africa, as key people in resistance against European control. Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and others helped form the Pan-African Federation in 1946. And the purpose of the Pan-African Federation was to foster cooperation among the various leaders in the African colonies who were pressing for independence. So this is a group of people who are highly educated, who have considerable international contact with each other, who have certain common goals. They're not operating in complete isolation. Now, the critical population in Kenya for independence was the Kikuyu tribes, located in the Central Highlands. They were especially important because they had suffered substantial, and were continuing to suffer substantial, loss of land as a result of European settlements. And of course, what happened after World War II is that, well, some Europeans had gone home to help fight the war. Even more came back, or came for the first time after the war. After the war, of course, conditions in Europe are not the best as countries struggle to get back on their feet after the war. And many Europeans migrated out to the colonies, assuming, correctly, that there were excellent economic opportunities for them there. So actually, the size of the European population in most African colonies was increasing after 1945. And in the case of Kenya, that meant increasing land seizures and affecting, in particular, the Kikuyus, who held the land in the most temperate areas of the country. Those conditions would help trigger armed resistance. In 1952, armed uprisings begin, led primarily, although not exclusively, by the Kikuyu. The Mau Mau Rebellion, as it was known. And the Mau Mau Rebellion would stretch until 1956, when it was finally suppressed. Some 20,000 people, most of them Kenyans, would die in this resistance and in the British counterinsurgency effort designed to suppress it. Now, Jomo Kenyatta was not a leader of the Mau Mau. He was a political leader. He was the leading figure in a Kikuyu confederation, which was, in its total, a political movement. But nevertheless, the British blamed him for the Mau Mau Rebellion. And even though Kenyatta offered a logical alternative here, just as Nkrumah had offered an opportunity for the British to turn over rule to a well-trained elite, so too Jomo Kenyatta offered the same opportunity. But the British refused to take that alternative, to say, well, we'll use Kenyatta, negotiate with him to end colonial rule, and that will largely solve the problem of the Mau Mau Rebellion, or at least it'll leave him to deal with the Mau Mau Rebellion. But they didn't do that because they were being pressured by some 400,000 British citizens who lived in Kenya not to surrender the colony. And this is why the armed struggle broke out, and why it continued for so long, and why the British would not surrender control of Kenya until 1964. Many people at the time, in the 1950s and early 60s, thought that there would be this massive white flight out of Kenya when independence was achieved. But actually, quite the opposite happened. The vast majority of Europeans stayed, because Kenyatta was quite conscious of the fact that no matter what, the Europeans played a central role in the economic system. He did not want to lose their capital, their operations, and so they became equal citizens in Kenya. People believed that there would be a problem because of the violence, but in fact the violence had been precipitated largely by the fact that the British were simply unwilling to surrender the colony because of the large European presence there. Another place where violence seemed to be a certainty, in fact many people thought that this would perhaps be the most violent struggle in all of Africa, was in South Africa. South Africa consisted primarily of three contending groups. One were the Boers. These were Dutch settlers, some of whom had begun arriving all the way back in the 17th century when the Dutch were conducting trade in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific and creating outposts in Africa. Their population had increased over the centuries. They now formed a substantial land-owning group, farms, ranches. The second group were the Africans, who had long been resident there and who were displaced in various ways by the Boers as they settled in southern Africa. And then the British, who also began populating South Africa. Again, initially it was an outpost on their way to other imperial holdings such as India. We might also throw in yet another group that comes as a result of the arrival of the British, and that is large numbers of people from India. But we'll try to keep it simple for the moment and talk about these three groups. Eventually, the Boers began migrating north away from the southern coast of Africa. They wanted to get away from British control. And they set up two republics of their own, leaving the British controlling what they called the Cape Colony. So you have the Cape Colony down at the southern tip of Africa, and then just above it, two Boer republics. The problem by the late 19th century was that gold and diamonds were being discovered in the Boer regions. So now the British had an interest in penetrating the Boer republics in order to exploit mining opportunities. So thousands of Englishmen start arriving in the Boer republics. And now there's concern among the Boers that the British will simply overwhelm them. The rising conflict over who was going to control the Boer republics and their mining wealth finally led to the Boer War breaking out in 1899, with the British dedicated to crushing the Boer states and establishing imperial rule for once and for all across southern Africa. And that indeed is what happens. It's worth noting that Cecil Rhodes, the famed British imperialist, for a time was governor of the Cape Colony, the British colony. He played a central role in helping bring on the war, getting the British involved in seizing these territories. In the end, after 1902, we have a single British colony now with a large Boer population, what becomes, in effect, South Africa. Discrimination against the African population has long existed and intensified as the mining discoveries were made, because now there was need for hundreds of thousands of Africans to work the diamond and gold mines. And this was not going to happen simply by them being offered high wages, which they weren't, but rather by forcing them to work in these mining operations. At the same time as the Europeans, including the British and the Boers, found themselves living in greater proximity with large numbers of Africans, they began enforcing strict rules of segregation, racial segregation. So these aspects of discrimination and segregation intensify as the populations begin to work in close proximity in the mining regions. A further extension of this discrimination came in 1913 when the British colony passes the Native Lands Act, which sounds like it might be meant to protect lands belonging to natives, but meant just the opposite, to create a legal structure by which tribal groups could be stripped of their lands. So Africans are going to face discrimination and segregation in the mining regions, and now increasingly they're going to face loss of land. These conditions remain in effect down to 1948, when a national election is held to put a sovereign government in power. In other words, South Africa will no longer be strictly a colony. It will have its own government, even though it's not a fully independent state. National elections are held in 1948, and they're won by the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party is representative of the Boer interests in South Africa. After 1948 is when the new nationalist government begins strictly enforcing a policy of apartheid, which means separateness, to separate the races. This was taking earlier forms of segregation and discrimination and making them part of the national law of South Africa and ensuring their enforcement throughout the borders of this nation. Among the things that were now implemented was a pass law, which meant that an African could not move in South Africa, and by that I mean not move permanently, but simply move from one place to another, without a pass justifying why he or she was doing this. If you're living in one city, you want to go visit your relatives in another, it might be just a 2-hour train ride, but you need a pass to show why you are going from one city to the other. And you can be sure you get on that train, the police are going to come through and they're going to be checking you to see if you have that pass. And if not, they'll arrest you. So this was a tightly controlled system. This wasn't just a matter of laws that said, well, you know, here are white-only facilities, restaurants, etc., that you might find in this country. well into the 20th century. Now, these were laws that were literally meant to control the black population down to the minutest detail, including where they lived and when they moved and why they moved from place to place. Another policy that was instituted in later years was the homelands policy. This policy set as a goal returning all Africans to their homelands, meaning that throughout South Africa there were various regions which had once been controlled by specific tribal groups. And it was now the announced goal of the South African government to move all Africans back into those homelands. Now, this is going to be a little difficult. There were about 20 million Africans, maybe 4 million whites or Europeans. And the homelands were a tiny fraction of the total size, the total territory of South Africa. Maybe 10, 15% of the total, because the homelands had been drastically carved down during the course of European control. A little bit like what happened to Native Americans in this country. Yeah, we're giving you all the land west of the Mississippi, except, well, we're taking this away, except we're taking that away, and pretty soon you're on a few reservations. Well, that's pretty much what happened to the Africans then. Oh yeah, this is your homeland, except now we're carving it in half because we want some of it for farms, etc. So the idea, supposedly, was you're going to take millions of people and force them on to these homelands, and that way you would achieve the ultimate in separateness. You'd have Africans living in various isolated locations around South Africa, and then everywhere else the Europeans would control. We'll see how well that's not going to work. Not surprisingly, these developments, since the time of the Boer War, had triggered resistance from the African population. I already talked about the emergence of independence movements in Africa, and specifically mentioned the African National Congress, which is created before World War I. Now, the African National Congress, as you might expect, as with the Congress Party in India, was a relatively conservative group initially. Consisted of some tribal leaders, lawyers, professional people, and they would issue tracts denouncing the government and raising legal challenges to various things like the Native Lands Act, etc. But it was not very militant. In fact, again, most such organizations in colonial areas in the early part of the 20th century were very similar in form. But as the apartheid policy is imposed, and as South Africa's economy also grows rapidly during World War II and increasingly industrializes, resistance mounts and militancy increases. And one particular figure, Nelson Mandela, emerges as the dominant influence in the African National Congress. Now, initially, the ANC, in the years after World War II, while dedicating itself to full independence for South Africa, sought to achieve that goal through nonviolence. Again, protests, legal filings, demonstrations. These were the efforts that were being made initially. And again, there's a practical side to this. It isn't just, well, philosophically we're opposed to violence. The issue was the South African state is heavily armed. It has a large military and police force. And it has shown itself quite willing to use that force indiscriminately to put down signs of unrest. So nonviolent methods were considered the only practical approach because of the overwhelming military superiority that the state enjoyed. However, by the end of the 1950s, Nelson Mandela and several other younger leaders in the ANC were pressing for armed resistance, that they felt nonviolent methods really weren't getting them anywhere. So that they were going to have to organize a guerrilla insurrection. Now, they understood, of course, that doing so within the borders of South Africa would be very difficult because of this very large military force that the South African state employed. However, they believed that by setting up some of their camps across the border from South Africa in neighboring states, they would be able to avoid outright suppression by the South African military. They would be able to support insurgents in South Africa from base camps over the border in areas that were lightly populated and where other colonial governments would have a hard time getting at them. So they launch armed rebellion against the South African state. One consequence of that is that Nelson Mandela is arrested and thrown into prison in 1963, and it was pretty much accepted that the South African government was throwing away the key, that he and other ANC leaders would never see the light of day again. During the course of the 1960s, the ANC continues its efforts, and indeed into the early 70s, to achieve an insurrection that will either topple the regime or at least force it to the negotiating table. Along the way, other forms of popular resistance also erupt in shanty towns, places like Soweto. These were vast areas of African settlement that ringed the major cities like Pretoria in South Africa. By this time, South Africa's economy is heavily dependent upon African labor. It is increasingly becoming an industrial economy. Aside from mining operations, there are all kinds of industrial enterprises, steel plants, automobile plants, plants producing military equipment of various kinds. South Africa was a major arms dealer in the world market. These industrial enterprises require vast amounts of labor. There are insufficient number of Europeans to man these enterprises, particularly at the wages that are being paid. So increasingly, the labor force in the industrial sector, and for that matter, most sectors of the economy, was made up of Africans. Now, of course, the Africans aren't going to be allowed to live with the Europeans, except unless they were domestic servants. So they're going to have to find other housing. And of course, no housing is going to be provided, so people build shanties, shacks, on the outskirts of the major cities so they'll have a place to live as they labor in the economy. Soweto indicated the unrest that was bubbling beneath the surface in these shanty towns, particularly among young people who were resistant to attempts by the government, for example, to impose Afrikaans, the Boer language, on Africans, to force them to learn that language. So here we have a young militant population that's demonstrating its willingness to go out and confront the government. Once again, of course, the government responds with massive force and violence, killing hundreds of people to put down the unrest. By this time, it was clear that the armed rebellion was not working. More and more of the insurgents were being killed. South Africans, the government was doing a fairly effective job of sealing off the borders and even crossing its own borders to strike at the guerrilla camps on the other side. So the armed resistance tactic by the mid-70s is clearly a failure. And it's unclear where the movement is now going to go. It's at this point that the African population essentially took over what was going to happen in a series of usually uncoordinated, at least originally, actions. People began organizing, protesting, and resisting. For example, African mine workers, African auto workers went on strike. But when they went on strike, they struck not only for higher wages, they also struck against discrimination, against apartheid. People began organizing boycotts of white merchants, trying to undermine the internal economy. They began staging mass protests. The government continued to use force against these groups. But as they did so, they helped spark even more demonstrations, even more boycotts. Now, the ANC leadership comes to recognize that this is the strategy that they need to put themselves at the head of. This was not something that was designed by the ANC leadership as the guerrilla insurrection had been. This was something that had occurred among groups in various urban settings, various, whether it's labor movements, teachers associations, student groups, and they had begun doing this. And finally, the ANC provides the leadership structure to coordinate all of this nationally. What the South African government came to realize during the 1980s was that it was increasingly unable to control the African population. The system of homelands that had been announced decades earlier had fallen apart. There was hardly any effort anymore to even pretend that people were going to be returned to their homelands, because it just wasn't possible. Aside from the fact that there wasn't enough land to support these people, the truth was the national economy depended on the labor of millions of Africans. So you can't ship them all off to homelands and then think there's going to be anybody to work in the mines and the factories. But more than that, the sheer numbers of the population who were taking up resistance action against the government made it increasingly difficult for the government to simply control the situation. It is that reality rather than some, ebony and ivory kind of realization. Oh yeah, we're brothers. It was the South African government realizing we can't control the situation anymore. So rather than seeing their eventual overthrow by these forces, the South African government chose accommodation. Better to ease a transition in rather than face this mass rebellion. So in 1990, Nelson Mandela is released from prison. And that is the great symbolic act, that the Boer government is going to start a transition to majority rule. National elections will be held. Nelson Mandela will emerge as the elected leader of South Africa. What amazed people, particularly given the experiences of the 1970s and 80s, was that this was all accomplished with so little violence in the end. Because here was a place, when almost all the rest of Africa had achieved liberation. South Africa was still there under European rule. So for it to emerge at this late date without a great deal of violence was taken as almost miraculous. It largely was the result of a pragmatic decision by the state realizing that it could not control this kind of mass popular uprising. But it left an issue much like in India, and one that still troubles South Africa today. And that is the inequalities, the economic and social inequalities that existed prior to independence under colonialism were not going to be fully addressed with the achievement of independence, because this was essentially a negotiated transition. Whites were going to be left in control of their property. There was not going to be some mass redistribution of property. And as a result, even today, there are huge disparities between a wealthy few, now including a certain element of the African elite, and the vast majority of the population, which is impoverished, just as in India. So one of the problems, one of the paradoxes of independence when it was achieved through nonviolent methods is it often left many of the problems of the colonial society in place. And those problems persist down to today. Now, the Middle East does not experience the same kind of long-term colonialism that most of Africa experienced. Certain parts of the Middle East, such as Egypt, had indeed been under colonial control since the 1880s. But most of what we term the Middle East today was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, however feeble it might have become. So when we talk about places in the modern Middle East like Turkey and Jordan and Syria and Iraq, we're talking about places that were all part still of the Ottoman Empire. They had not been subordinated by Western colonial powers. However, World War I gives the final death blow to the Ottoman Empire. It effectively collapses as of 1919. And out of it emerge a series of separate political entities. Most significantly at the beginning, the modern state of Turkey. Now, as we begin looking at the Middle East and its emergence from European control, we're going to see three traditions, if you will. Mustafa Kemal of Turkey represents one of those traditions. Mustafa Kemal, or he's often referred to as Ataturk, was a nationalist. His interest was in creating a nation state focused on the Turkish people. And in creating this Turkish Republic, he went to great lengths to establish what was predominantly a secular state, with civil courts, civil law, and the disestablishment of Islam, meaning Islam was no longer the official state religion. Now, this is completely at odds with Islamic tradition, because Islam, as we noted much earlier in the course, envisions its influence as pervasive in society. In most Islamic societies, the legal system, the judicial system, is based on Islamic law. Usually the political system is heavily influenced by the religious establishment. So Islam is pervasive throughout society, setting the norms of behavior for individuals, conduct between males and females, etc. Commercial law, rooted in Islamic law. But here, with Mustafa Kemal, we have a particularly extreme example of someone who was a nationalist and who wanted to modernize and who wanted to minimize the role of Islam in the larger society. Not that Islam was still not going to be the religion of Turkey, it was. But the kind of pervasive influence it might hold in other societies would not prove to be the case in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal is sort of one extreme version of the nationalist tradition, and we will see others. People who are less bent on total secular societies, but nevertheless are nationalists, who see the future of their societies focused around the creation of a nation state. A second tradition that we're going to see emerge is that of monarchy, heavily influenced by the Europeans. As the Europeans take control of much of the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they are going to create dynastic systems in much of the Middle East to rule these states. And a third tradition that we'll come to in a few minutes is an Islamist tradition, one that argues that the main focus of identity for our states, our societies, should not be the state itself, but Islam. And indeed, Islamic law should rule. Politics should be rooted in Islamic tradition, as should social codes, social mores. These three contending political traditions are what come to dominate the Middle East in the 20th century. Now, as I said, Turkey is an exception in terms of the extent to which Mustafa Kemal sought to secularize society. It was also an exception in the sense that most of the rest of the old Ottoman Empire was going to be carved up by the European powers. After World War I, they set about slicing and dicing. The British got Palestine, which at that time included what is now Jordan, as well as Iraq. The French got Syria, which included what is now Lebanon. So most of the old Ottoman Empire is carved up by the Europeans. And they impose, well, they don't call these colonies. They are, in effect, colonies. Supposedly, these are areas of European domination, custodial states created by the Europeans to supposedly prepare these people for independence. A further element that's introduced into the history of the Middle East at this time is the Balfour Declaration, issued by the British Prime Minister David Balfour in 1917. And essentially, what it commits Britain to do is to create a state for Jews in the Middle East, to create a homeland. We won't get into the reasons Balfour didn't do this because he wanted to be nice to the Jewish population. He had political reasons for doing it, but we won't get into those. But this becomes another critical element, that the Europeans are not only going to create essentially dependent states that they are going to govern, in effect, as they divide up the Ottoman Empire, they're also going to set the goal of creating a Jewish state within the Middle East. Now, Arabs did not respond well to this custodial role that the Europeans had assigned themselves. And there are rebellions, armed resistance, as well as demonstrations against European rule throughout the Middle East during the 1920s. To try to stabilize the situation, the European powers begin creating dynasties, arguing that, well, look, you people shouldn't be unhappy because you're going to have your own king, and this will be coming from one of the distinguished families of the region. Saudi Arabia, the Saudis, basically getting to control the Arabian Peninsula. The Hussein family, two brothers are appointed from the Hussein family to rule Iraq and Jordan. Meanwhile, the king of Egypt is reinstalled in his position, even though he depends on British military force to keep him in power. So a series of monarchies are created during the 1920s to serve as, if you will, the puppet rulers of these states that are actually controlled by the Europeans. This didn't do a lot, actually, to quell unrest. And there is continuing pressure from nationalists and from even the new dynasties themselves for full independence. By the late 1940s, most of these states have achieved independence from the Europeans. World War II helped bring to an end, as it did in Africa, European control. The Europeans simply did not have the wherewithal to go on resisting these various movements calling for independence, so the states are released into independent rule. But of course, the Europeans are able to do this with only minimal reluctance because they have left in place a series of dynasties in Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt that are beholden to them. So they feel they have close allies among the people who now rule most of these states. But even as independence is achieved, new tensions are arising because a Jewish state, Israel, is now being formed in the Middle East. That state emerges in part out of a war between Jews and Arabs that creates or leads an independent Jewish state in 1948. These battles pitted Zionists, Jews who wanted a homeland, against Arabs who looked upon the Jewish population as a European problem. The argument of the Arabs is, look, most of these people are coming from Europe. They're coming from Europe because of the Holocaust, because of their persecution, and they had been coming ever since the 1930s. You know, that's your problem. Why are you putting the problem in our hands? Why are we losing land? So this has set off, as we all well know, some 6 decades of struggle between Israel and its various Arab neighbors. Another force that comes to influence events is the rise now of a whole new group of nationalist leaders. We saw Mustafa Kemal in Turkey back in the 1920s. But by the 1950s and 60s, other nationalist leaders are coming to the fore, in many cases by toppling the monarchies left by the Europeans. In Egypt in 1952, an Egyptian military officer, Gamal Abdel Nasser, topples the monarchy and establishes a new nation state and announces his own policy of pan-Arabism, a desire to unite all of the Arab peoples of the Middle East into a single state, something that would or has not happened. But nevertheless, here was a new example of a nationalist, someone who was concerned with the creation of a powerful nation state, of resisting foreign domination, but who was only marginally concerned with the role of Islam within his society. The hallmark event of Nasser's rule was the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. Up until that time, the British still had control over the canal. So nationalizing the canal in 1956, taking over complete control by the Egyptian government, was a hallmark event not only for Nasser but for Arabs throughout the Middle East. The idea that this technological symbol of European dominance had now been put under the control of an Arab nation, reverberated throughout the region. It also sent shockwaves through Europe, with both the British and the French deeply concerned about the fact that an Arab state would actually dare to nationalize a major European asset. Remember, it's not just the Suez Canal that's a major asset for the Europeans in the Middle East, but oil wells that are all over the place. And the Suez Canal still serves as a critical international route for the Europeans seeking to access their interests in Asia. England and France and Israel, fearing the growing power of the Egyptians and their strong anti-Israel stance, these three countries combined to attack Egypt. The Egyptians resist, and the United States and the Russians, for their own reasons, insist on a halt to the war. Both the Russians because they had growing influence in Egypt, and the Americans because they knew that if the French and the British and the Israelis seized the Suez Canal, it would set off an explosion throughout the Middle East. So for those very practical reasons, both superpowers demand an end to the war. But it was indicative of the militant nationalist spirit that was now reverberating throughout the Middle East. Another example of this comes in Syria and Iraq. There, in the late 1940s, a political movement known as the Ba'athist Party was formed, officially a socialist political party. It too, the Ba'athists, just like Nasser, was dedicated to the idea of Arab nationalism, creating a strong modern state. And only marginally concerned with issues of Islam and its influence. What these people are concerned with is a powerful state, a powerful military, economic development. Eventually, the Ba'athist Party provided the political mechanism by which Saddam Hussein rose to power in 1979. One thing that's worth noting about this and understanding Saddam's roots is that he was fundamentally a vehement Iraqi nationalist. He was not interested in issues of political Islam. Yet another such organization is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which emerges among the Palestinian population that has been ousted from Israel and is now living largely in Jordan and in certain territories, Palestinian territories, bordering Israel. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is meant to create an independent Palestinian state. And it, too, is focused on the ideas of nationalism, just as identified in European experience. These people are concerned with the modern state and political apparatus, economic development. The issue of Islam, sure, they're all Muslims, but they don't see Islam as playing the dominant role in their societies or their cultures. So Yasser Arafat and the PLO has a lot in common with the Ba'athist Party, with Gamal Abdel Nasser. These are typical Arab nationalists of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s who are focused on creating strong, independent states. So by the 1970s, we're really looking at two groups in the Middle East that dominate. The monarchical regimes that had survived since being set up by the Europeans in the 1920s in places like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the nationalist regimes, which had usually displaced monarchies in places like Egypt, Iraq, Syria. These are the two main traditions of Middle Eastern politics as of the 1970s. Monarchical regimes, nationalist regimes. But most people in these societies would see common traits in these two types of regimes. Almost inevitably, both the dynastic systems and the nationalist systems were autocracies. They were top-down regimes with little in the way of democratic participation. Whether you're talking Ba'athists, whether you're talking the Saudi princes, these are top-down regimes, autocratic regimes. And almost inevitably, most of these societies suffer from severe economic underdevelopment. There are rare exceptions, such as Saudi Arabia, which has enormous oil wealth, but even there is a vast population of immigrant workers who share only marginally in the prosperity of Saudi Arabia. But most Middle Eastern states, whether it was a monarchy or a nationalist regime, suffered both from a lack of democratic institutions and a lack of economic development. This helps give popular backing to a third political tradition that I briefly mentioned, and that is the tradition of political Islam. The idea that national identity should not be focused on the idea that, well, we're a people who share a common language, common borders, common history, but rather our identity should be the fact that we are all Muslims. This is a course of political thought that has a long history in the Middle East. Back in the 18th century, in the Arabian Peninsula, back in the 18th century when the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East, in the southern Arabian Peninsula, a movement developed known as Wahhabism. The Wahhabists were militant Islamists. They believed that the Ottoman Sultan was failing to fulfill his obligations as an Islamic ruler, that Sharia, Islamic law, and the traditions and mores of the Islamic faith were not being strictly enforced. And they rebelled against the Ottoman sultans because of what they believed was their corruption of Islamic society. The Wahhabists were crushed by the Ottoman military, but their influence would continue to reverberate through the Arabian Peninsula down to the present day. Osama bin Laden's family is a part of that Wahhabist tradition. There were other militant Islamic movements. The Muslim Brotherhood, created in Egypt in 1928. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood struggled for independence for Egypt, but its ultimate goal was the creation of a true Islamic society with the strict enforcement of Islamic law, Islamic mores, etc. For a time, in the 1950s, the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, cooperated with Gamal Abdel Nasser. They had common vision of creating a powerful Egyptian state, freeing it of all foreign influence. But increasingly, the Muslim Brotherhood came to denounce Nasser because they believed he was betraying their Islamic goals, that he was not giving Islam its proper influence in the new nation state of Egypt. These movements want to see societies where Islam's influence is pervasive, not just in the mosque, but in the law courts, in common culture. They believe many of the states, the political systems that control the Middle East today, whether they are dynastic or nationalist, whether it's Saddam Hussein or the King of Saudi Arabia, have corrupted their societies, have failed to live up to the principles of Islam. And they want to topple those types of states. They are also resistant to Western influences, which they see as an important source of such corruption. American popular culture, for example, in addition to their resistance to foreign economic domination. Other Islamist movements have emerged in Lebanon. Hezbollah, which is largely supported by the Shiite branch of Islam in Lebanon. Hamas in Palestine, offering an Islamist alternative to the PLO. These movements have grown in popularity during the 1970s, 80s, and through the 1990s, in no small part because of what many people in these countries view as the failure of both the dynastic and nationalist institutions that had ruled these countries since the 1940s. Islamists are offering an alternative to these, offering to create, in fact, societies where Islam is truly pervasive in its influence and where foreign influence, whether it's in the form of culture or economics, is largely going to be repelled. So, in the modern Middle East, we see experiences of colonialism, although those are relatively limited. Most of the Middle East was controlled only briefly by the Europeans from 1919 until, let's say, the mid-1940s. But in the case of the Middle East, these societies were heavily influenced by Western culture, Western economics. One of the fundamental aspects of Western culture is secularism, the idea that you separate the religious from the secular, from everyday life. That largely conflicts with Islamist beliefs and the idea of a religion which has influence throughout society and affects all aspects of its functioning. In these conditions, we have seen several different political responses. Aside from the monarchical states set up by the Europeans, the popular responses that have emerged in the Middle East were the nationalist movements, like Nasser's movement, like the Ba'athist Party, and now Islamist political movements, both of which want to create strong nation states, but each of which envisions that state and that society in a very different way. Nationalists, yes, remain Muslim, but they also see a major role for Western influence, for secular functions in societies. Islamists believe that there should be a predominant influence by Islam, and that nationalist movements essentially represent just another corrupting force that undermines the influence of Islam in their societies. So here we have a fairly complex reaction. In other cases, in Africa and India, much of the concern was simply ending political domination from the outside, and secondarily, seeking alternative routes to economic development, such as socialism. But here in the Middle East, it isn't just a question of what was a passing period of Western domination, but a reaction to Western influences that conflicted with many of the principles of political Islam. When we look at national liberation as a whole, the end of the colonial order, there are really two major aspects of this. One is the decline of Europe as a result of two world wars and the Great Depression. And on the other side, mounting resistance in places like India and Vietnam and the Middle East, driven partly by economic change, the rise of new social classes, the rise of Western educated elites who use that education to offer alternatives to colonialism. The goals of these liberation movements, wherever we find them, are fairly common: to create nation states, governing bodies, modern state institutions, economic development, which in many cases was woefully lacking in the old colonial order, and developing a sense of national identity. A not insignificant point, because for most people, whether we're talking people in India or Africa, prior to the arrival of colonialism, their identity was not that of a nation state. Their affinities were to tribal groupings, extended kin groups, various dynasties. So the creation of a national identity is a major project in the process of achieving national liberation. National liberation, the end of colonialism, has led to major issues confronted by these new states. One was whether to pursue capitalism as a course of economic development. And fairly consistently, most of these new states rejected capitalism initially because, to them, it represented the worst aspects of European colonialism: the exploitation of their labor, the control of their natural resources, and the creation of economies that were distorted in their development, focused almost exclusively on the creation of raw materials to be fed into the European industrial plants. So most of them would seek some version of socialism as an alternative. The second question was establishing a national identity. And this was not easy. Another legacy of colonialism is that in most of these societies, people of distinct ethnic, religious, racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, were forced together into the same colonial system and emerged as common members of these new states, but often with very little in common otherwise, whether it was language, ethnicity, religion. So forging a national identity out of these disparate and often rival groups has proved to be a major challenge in most of the new societies. And finally, as a product of that, most of them have faced problems with ethnic and religious divisions that continue to trouble much of the developing world, even down to today.